It's gone 7, so I think we might start. On this very cold, wet, wintry night, welcome to all the brave souls who came here through the heavy weather, and welcome also to the people who are watching us on live streaming and much more sensibly decided that they were going to stay home in the warm. Here at Christchurch, we're mindful of the land on which we live, for its breath of life-giving, its history of lives that have walked before us, and for its ongoing renewal. And we're mindful that this is the land of the Kaurna people, and we express our respect for their past and ongoing stewardship and care for this land. If you haven't been before, just a bit of housekeeping. The facilities, gentlemen and ladies, are in the foyer, and there is also, through the door to my left there, there's also a disability toilet available. It's an interesting topic we have tonight. It seems simple. What can Christians learn from the Hindu faith? And what it starts me thinking of is not just Hindu faith, but here at PCNet we have had Buddhist speakers, we've had Muslim speakers. For us, being progressive means widening the scope and offering the hand of friendship and listening. Because if you listen and talk to other people, you inevitably learn something. Our speaker tonight, Vadivella Belle, happens to be a friend of mine. We go back more years than I care to remember to Flinders University in the 1960s and early 70s. And both of us came back to Flinders later on in our careers and our lives, working with Jeff Boyce in what was the Religious Centre and became Oasis Student Centre. So apart from the fact that Carl is a published author, he was a diplomat working for the government, he's travelled widely in India. Apart from all those things, Carl was the first Hindu chaplain at Flinders University. So I guess more than anything, I can recommend tonight's talk to you as coming from someone who knows what it is like to work with people of other faiths, to work with, to live with, and to understand people of other faiths. And I hope that that's what we're continuing to do at PCNet here, continuing to listen to other faiths as well as our own, exploring other faiths, exploring our own. That's what being progressive is all about. Not better than, but please talk to me, please explain to me. So, welcome, Carl. We're pleased to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much for and thank you for your introduction, Maureen. Yes, I remember back to 67. I thought I should commence this talk by providing some general background as to how and why I became a Hindu, before moving on to a basic analysis of Hindu beliefs, and then a wider discussion of the impact of British colonialism on Hinduism and its lasting legacy. I was baptised in what was once the Lutheran Church on Goodwood Road and Door Park. My family, following changes in my father's career, moved successively from Belair in the Adelaide Hills to Penola, Robe and then Renmark, where my father managed the local ABC. During this time, my religious beliefs gradually became severely strained. This followed the publication in the local press of an essay I had written on the book, The Wind in the Willows, focusing upon the chapter of the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. My pastor informed me in vehement terms that I'd become an adolescent pagan, and when I left the church, he pursued the matter with my parents. I duly lapsed into agnosticism, though at this stage I had not rejected Christianity. That sounds a bit odd, but basically the Christian message still resonated with me. In 1967, following completion of my secondary education, I enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts degree at Flinders University. Shortly after commencing my studies, I was informed that my parents' marriage was about to end in divorce, a development of which I had no prior inkling. A week later, my brother-in-law, to whom I was close, drowned in a swimming accident in Renmark. And this led to a period of personal instability, and I left Flinders in 1969 with my degree incomplete. Between November 1969 and March 1970, I worked as a yard labourer come long-distance truck driver for a building firm, and then in late March of 1970, inspired by George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, I worked for 2 years as a manual grave digger, both in Centennial Park here in Adelaide and Karrakatta in Perth. In Karrakatta, my allegedly hairy appearance led to me being detailed to deal with the graves of religious minorities. The noted religious scholar John Bowker has postulated that the issue of death and its mysteries are often regarded as a starting point for the exploration of human spirituality. Certainly, my own continual proximity to the reality of death and the raw emotional power of human grief and the mechanisms used to explain this overall phenomenon led me to question the rather threadbare philosophies by which I lived. In 1976, after I'd commenced my professional life with the Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra, I was offered and accepted a diplomatic post in Kuala Lumpur. My position involved close work with Malaysian educational authorities and students. Most of those with whom I dealt were Muslims, but my work also involved extensive contact with Buddhists, Taoists and Hindus. In early 1978, I witnessed the powerful Hindu festival of Thaipusam, which had a profound impact on me. I made a point of witnessing the festival again in 1979. However, at this stage, there was no Damascene conversion, and it was only after my return to Australia that I was finally prepared to accept that I'd found a powerful route to explore my emerging spirituality. I returned to Malaysia in 1981 to participate in this festival, the first of 21 such pilgrimages, 19 in Kuala Lumpur, 1 in Penang and 1 in Palani, South India. After my third pilgrimage, I changed my middle name, became a vegetarian and closely studied Shaivite Hindu texts. I need hardly add, although I regard religion as a deeply personal matter and abjure any form of proselytisation and continue to receive excellent work reports, my adoption of Hinduism ended my public service career. Hinduism is generally regarded as the oldest religion in the world, with its origins tracing back over 4,000 years to the Indus Valley civilization. The religion is also known as the Sanatana Dharma, or the eternal law. The religion's foundations lie in the Vedic tradition, a collection of hymns which continue to form the core of Hindu religious practice and philosophy. Later key periods include the development of the scriptures known as the Upanishads, circa 800 BCE to 400 BCE, which introduced concepts such as Brahman, the ultimate reality, and Atman, the soul, and focused upon introspective spirituality rather than mere ritual. This was followed by the classical period, circa 500 BCE to 500 CE, which witnessed the emergence of the great epics such as the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Bhagavad Gita, which explicated Hindu concepts of personal duty and devotion, as well as the wider nature of the universe. These texts are supplemented by the Puranas, a vast body of texts consisting of myths, legends, and historical narratives that explores such issues such as the creation of the universe, the genealogy of multiple gods and kings, and stories about the cosmic play of avatars or manifestation of the divine. The renowned and prolific scholar Wendy Doniger has described the Puranas as representing the greatest manifestation of creative imagination in human history. The central message of Hindu doctrine is that as an essential oneness exists beyond a multitude of forms, and that the pursuit and distillation of truth, which leads to ultimate reality, is attained by certain techniques of devotion, meditation, and disciplined forms of concentration and contemplation. We generally label deviations which move beyond mundane consciousness by a variety of terms, including intuition, revelation, clairvoyance, or premonition. All of these may be received as messages from deeper layers of consciousness which transcend mundane experience. For Hindus, reality is beyond time, form, and space, so that all of these experiences are merely a movement of individual consciousness beyond the bounds of routine existence or day-to-day reality. Hinduism is an extremely complex religion which recognises no single founder, but rather a multitude of influences and contributions. Its central emphasis is the doctrine of Brahman Atman, that is, the omnipotence and omnipresence of Brahman, which permeates all existence and is the underlying self or Atman. The realisation of the latter leads to unity with Brahman. The central teaching of Hinduism is the concept of Brahman, the ultimate reality, formless, infinite, and beyond human comprehension, existing both in the world and beyond it. Everything in the universe is seen as an expression of Brahman. Human behaviour is understood to be directed by certain precepts. In fundamental terms, these include karma, the laws of cause and effect, that is, that all actions have consequences that in human terms often reach beyond a single lifetime, dharma, the moral and ethic duties in a single life, samsara, or the cycle of birth, death and rebirth, the endless of migration of the soul, which ultimately results in moksha, the final liberation, which comprises the realisation of the true nature of self, Atman, and its unity with Brahman. Hinduism is both polytheistic and monotheistic, but in reality the many gods and goddesses are but manifestations of the divine reality of Brahman. Hinduism offers multiple paths to spiritual growth. These are known as the 4 yogas. The different approaches are often predicated on individual needs, and the paths often overlap. These paths are Karma Yoga, consisting of the path of action, incorporating selfless service and righteous action; Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, emphasising worship of a personal deity; Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, that is, the pursuit of wisdom through meditation and contemplation; and Raja Yoga, the path of meditation consisting of the stilling of the senses to gain control of the mind and achieve spiritual awakening. In personal terms, the journey offers the individual seeker a pathway to higher Hinduism. And repeated incarnation and disciplined spiritual practice, often under the guidance of a recognised teacher or guru. I emphasise recognised teacher or guru because there are plenty of false prophets around. Hinduism is a diverse religion and consists of several different sects that are structured on the veneration of specific deities and the particular philosophical emphasis and paths of worship they embody. The main sects include Vaishnavism, or the worship of Vishnu in his incarnations, especially Krishna and Rama; Shaivism, to which I belong, consisting of the worship of Shiva, who represents creation, destruction and regeneration, especially in the form of Nataraja; and Shaktiism, or the worship of the deity as goddess, the Divine Mother, especially in the forms of Lakshmi, Durga and Kali. Sometimes commentators add the smaller school of Smartism, which is based upon plumbing the universality of the divine. It needs to be emphasised that these sects often overlap, and a philosophical sense of divine oneness often overrides strict adherence to sectional differences. And this can be very confusing for people coming into Hinduism or trying to explore it, because you will find quite often that people accessing one path take action in another. To these sects we must add the widespread presence of popular or village Hinduism. The scholar C.J. Fuller describes popular Hinduism as, quote, the beliefs and practices that constitute the practical religion of ordinary Hinduism, end of quote. He describes it as, quote again, a religion of pragmatism with an admixture of Sanskritic or higher Hinduism. It may involve worship of village or tutelary gods, propitiation and manipulation of spirits, but it also includes elements of classical scripture, traditions and mythologies, as well as worship of universal deities. Scholars have pointed out there is a constant negotiation of boundaries between classical and popular Hinduism. In general, the Hindu temple is the primary focus of communal worship. All major temples are constructed according to the rules of Vastu, or the Hindu science of building. The Bhakti tradition identifies the temple, or koil, as a sacred miniature universe. The temple is viewed as a royal palace, and the deity ensconced within is equated to divine kingship and is both sovereign ruler and iconographic centre of the temple. It also serves as a sacred venue in which a community of co-sharers formed in the sight of a particular god. Far more importantly, it is regarded as a sacred venue which links heaven and earth and provides a liminal point of crossing in which the boundaries between devotees and the deity are both permeable and navigable. This embodies the logic of progression from the outer world of flux, shapes and forms to the still transcendence of the centre. One of the most widely criticised aspects of Hinduism, particularly in Western eyes, is the caste system, a traditional social hierarchy that theoretically orders societies into four main groupings, or three in South India, namely Brahmins, priests and scholars, Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, Vaishnavas, merchants and landowners, and Sudras, labourers and service providers. Although the caste system was officially abolished in India at the time of independence, it continues to exert a significant social impact. Well, that's a general overview of Hinduism, and I wanted to turn now to the ideological assumptions that underpinned British rule in India and how these assumptions shaped British policy, and how in turn they had a kinetic effect on those over whom they ruled. You wouldn't believe listening to me that I'm the son of a newsreader on the ABC, would you? And British India consisted of a breathtaking conglomeration of ethnic, linguistic, regional, caste and religious formations. British Orientalist scholarship interpreted Indian society according to a series of assumptions that were assumed to be axiomatic. These were firstly that India was a timeless, static and largely immutable society that was impervious to change. Secondly, that throughout its entire history, Indian politics had been governed by theocratic despots, which in turn justified the strong hand of the British. Thirdly, that all of the civilisations that had invaded India had declined under the impact of the intolerable climate, coupled with the degeneration resulting from promiscuous intermarriage, and finally, that all knowledge of Indian religious customs and law could be derived from ancient texts that should now be redeployed to guide the British administration. Following the Great Rebellion of 1857-58, also known as the Indian Mutiny, caste was viewed as the functional principle of organisation with Indian society. In 1785, Sir William Jones, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Calcutta, founded the highly influential Asiatic Society of Bengal. Jones believed that the key to understanding India, and in particular Indian law, could only be located by deep exploration of antique and hence authoritative texts, free of the baggage of later commentaries or amendments. British Oriental scholarship determined that the long superseded Manu Dharma Shastra, the law of Manu, was the original and most authentic guide to Hindu law. In interpreting Indian languages and cultures, Jones employed a methodology which scholar Thomas Troutman has described as mosaic ethnology, a methodology refracted through a literalist biblical chronology largely described in the book of Genesis. At this point, it was widely accepted among British scholars that the creation had occurred some 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. Following the Great Flood, and furious at the insulting behaviour of his son Ham, Noah had cursed Ham's descendants to eternal servitude to the descendants of his other two sons. The scholar Robin Blackburn, in his definitive study of slavery, has shown that biblical scholarship identified, turn this over, identified Hamitic people as possessors of dark skins. In accordance with this scholarship, Jones concluded that Indians were a Hamitic people. By this definition, following God's destruction of the Tower of Babel, Noah's descendants were dispersed across the face of the globe. Mosaic ethnology, was thus structured around three basic axioms. Firstly, that the complete history of the earth was compressed within a few thousand years. Secondly, that Ham's descendants were condemned to labour for those of his two brothers. And thirdly, that the monolingual population of the earth had scattered throughout the world from a pristine central point. Mosaic ethnology was also viewed as a master narrative of universal history that could be used to connect languages. Early scholars of European scholars of Sanskrit had discovered that Sanskrit was very similar to ancient Greek and Latin. They concluded that Sanskrit was a language of great antiquity and that the Vedas had been composed after the destruction of the Tower of Babel. And that as a consequence, India could be viewed as one of the oldest biblical civilizations, a living museum of what Europe had once been. In his infamous official report on India, the Benthamite scholar James Mill reiterated the antiquated law of Manu as the crucial key to understanding the organisational principles of Indian society. While Sanskrit was placed within the European family of languages, further studies revealed a discrete group of languages that were primarily located in South India, and which we know as Dravidian languages today, and which had existed prior to the arrival of Sanskrit. The prominent scholar Max Muller postulated that an invading Japhetic, light-skinned Aryan race had vanquished the dark-skinned indigenous Hamitic race. He identified the Japhetic race as the Brahmins of South India. Muller also postulated that the Brahmins had not displaced the indigenous Dravidian races, in inverted commas, but had colonised them. This perspective was given wider prominence by Bishop Robert Caldwell, who blamed Brahmins for his failure to win converts to Christianity. Now, the central assumptions of this mosaic view of the world was displaced, though not eliminated, by archaeological and geological studies, which revealed that the earth itself was of far greater antiquity than 6,000 years, thus gradually undermining the notion that biblical timelines were central to an understanding of human history. These interpretations were increasingly displaced by Darwinian evolutionary theory as, quote, the determinant of all important traits of body and soul and personality of human beings and nations, end of quote. Since any society's racial characteristics supposedly ineluctably shaped its culture and outlook, it was therefore possible to grade all human races within an overarching taxonomy, a racial trajectory impelled by the concepts of progress and creativity, both defined by European perspectives, conjoined with the survival of the fittest as the critical principle of human organisation. Social Darwinism could also be deployed to document the putative weaknesses of races deemed inferior. The reversal of evolution was racial degeneration, the result of unregulated human interaction, particularly promiscuous intermarriage. Degeneration explained the phenomenon of so-called stationary societies and so-called uncivilised peoples, as well as the deterioration and form of powerful civilisation. British racial theory assigned great weight to skin colour in determining a people's standing. Socio-biological status was measured in proportion to darkness of hue. Darwinism insisted that the Aryans who had colonised India had subjugated their so-called lesser compatriots, the Dravidian Aboriginals. However, the Aryans with their higher civilisation had over time degenerated, the result of careless intermarriage with indigenous Dravidians. Moreover, the Dravidians, with their supposedly wholly degrading religions, were responsible for the imagined superstition abominations which allegedly studied modern Hinduism. Here in 1901 is Charles Johnston, a high-ranking Methodist missionary, writing of the Tamils. This was a race, black in skin, low in stature and with matted locks, in war treacherous and cunning, in food disgusting. Anybody that's eaten South Indian food will immediately dispute that. And in ceremonial absolutely deficient. To this black race, magnetic of wild imaginings, we must trace every lurid and demonic element in the beliefs of India. According to British perspectives, racial decay among the Aryan Indians had proceeded to the point where renewal or regeneration was assessed as impossible. Census operations, which began in India in 1872, accumulated vast bodies of data which allowed the British to construct a complete Indian bioracial taxonomy. The British deciphered caste in terms of theoretical systems described in classical Hindu texts. Many of these categories were in fact the creation of the British Colonial Office. Major consequences were the institutionalisation of caste, the expansion of Brahmin power, and the institutionalisation of so-called untouchability, so that what had been a localised phenomenon became a generic descriptor for many poor groups within India. Colonial ideologies institutionalised Brahmanic and early textual frameworks as essential Hinduism, in the process discounting and marginalising all popular manifestations of Hindu belief in practice. In addition, the created, unbounded and supposedly deeply antagonistic communities labelled Hindu and Muslim, many of which manifested in liminal forms, initiated communal activism and antagonism, which would produce catastrophic consequences. So what lessons can we draw from all of this? Historically, the trajectory of Hinduism has been incremental. That is, modifications have usually been accompanied by the discreet dispensing or sidelining of antiquated customs and practices. British rule had a profound impact upon this sense of gradualism. Some of the more dramatic outcomes of British reinterpretation of Hinduism included the emphasis on caste structures and the universalisation of untouchability, the stimulation of anti-Brahmin political structures and imagined historic narratives in Dravidian India. More profound British innovations included the compartmentalisation of Islam and Hinduism, religions that over the centuries had, on the ground level, forged liminal impulses, but were now to develop separate and increasingly antagonistic identities, which finally led to the barbarism of partition. Political British resistance to British India produced such outstanding figures as Gandhi, Tagore and Nehru, as well as revolutionaries such as Subhash Chandra Bose. Perhaps the most destructive reaction was the imagined sense of an historic Hindu nationhood which was built around the manufactured and poisonous historical narratives of Vinaya Damodar Savarkar, later manifesting in the Hindutva movement, which now governs India, a negative and vengeful force that had hitherto been largely absent from Hinduism. By way of contrast, changes in Christianity have been structured on inventory of interpretations of the scriptures and resulted changes in religious methodology associated with these shifts. One does not have to detail the history of Abrahamic religions to demonstrate the perceived paradigmatic shifts in religious interpretation have often stimulated profoundly violent responses. In passing, I would suggest that social Darwinism, evolutionary theory, and the later pseudoscience of eugenics had an impact on Christianity that were as profound and possibly more destructive than the impact of British modernity upon Hinduism. So out of all this, what to people of goodwill can we offer as a basis for dialogue and, more important, acceptance? First, I would suggest that the image of a gentle, wise, forgiving and humble Jesus is readily accessible to the Hindu imagination. Indeed, Mahatma Gandhi frequently referred to this vision of Christ as inspirational to his own personal philosophy. Secondly, the idea of a Christian heaven as a place of peaceful repose is not all that far removed from the concept of union of Atman with Brahman. The Hindu idea of all rivers, representing religions and beliefs, ultimately flowing into the one sea as a metaphor for all spiritual pathways leading to the divine, is perhaps a concept that can be shared between all religions. I realise that these are modest suggestions. Perhaps they form a tentative basis for mutual respect and understanding. And that's what I've prepared. And I would just make one or two other comments that based upon my work as a gravedigger some time ago, the concept of social Darwinism has definitely changed the way the Europeans commemorate death. And the scholar Pat Jelland, in her excellent book on Victorian death and its ceremonial, has pointed this out, that the change in the way we commemorate the dead has changed beyond belief, even since when I was working as a gravedigger, where we still had formal funerals rather than people's favourite music and the generic solemnity of funerals. But that's a byproduct. And but Hinduism has given me an extraordinary vision on life, and it's given me a spirituality I never dreamt that I would possess. It is, Wendy will tell you, it has changed my life in so many ways over the years. Whatever happened with the Department of Foreign Affairs is all behind me. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to discuss anything that I've raised or to answer any questions or to initiate a general discussion.
Thank you, Carl. Fascinating. I will say that if you have a question, something that you'd like to ask Carl, what we do ask is that you come out here to the microphone to ask it, because of the people watching on live streaming, to make sure that they can hear the questions clearly and understand. So if you're not the sort of person who usually likes to come out the front and say your bit, please take your courage in both hands. If you have a good question to ask, please come out the front and ask it. Yes, Michael.
Thank you for your presentation, Carl. Can you give us a distinction between the Buddhist term nirvana for enlightenment and how that contrasts to the Hindu moksha of which you spoke?
Well, in fact, the idea of nirvana and the idea of final liberation are much the same, and you will find the same in the Taoist concept of the divine, that basically it's a question of living through karma and dharma, of progressing, if you like, from the outer world of shapes and forms to the inner transcendence of union with the divine. Buddhism does not recognise the idea of a God as clearly as Hinduism. It's more the concept of a transcendence which is divine but is not shaped by the divine. It is shaped by an ethical approach and a deeper absorption, whereas Hinduism, that absorption is into the divine. In actual fact, I've discussed this issue with Buddhists and we've gone round in circles, and essentially the Buddhists have ended up saying, but we're talking about the same thing. And I said, yes, but there is an emphasis on consciousness in Buddhism, which is a transcendent consciousness. In Hinduism, there is an emphasis upon a divine God with whom we unify. Really, that is all I could possibly discern. As I say, I've discussed this issue. I have Buddhist friends in Malaysia and in Australia. In fact, I shared a room with the Buddhist chaplain when I was at Flinders, and we discussed this until we agreed not to discuss it. Because in actual fact, it is Buddhism that is seen by a lot of Hindus as incredibly similar and as the little brother of Hinduism, which of course Buddhists don't like being described as such. But Taoism has a similar thing of Tao the way, of rejecting the divisions of society or the divisions between good and evil and finding the middle path which leads to a blessed understanding. I haven't come across any Taoist chaplains yet, But when Wendy and I were in Taiwan last year, the concept that was given to us, I could recognise it straight away. And neither of us felt any hesitation in worshipping in Taoist temples. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, please come out. Thank you, Carl, for that. I, too, have done a fair degree of studying about the Hindu tradition, mainly coming out of Father Bede Griffiths. I don't know if you're aware of him, and he had an ashram south of what was then Madras, and he actually did come, certainly he visited Perth, and whether he visited here. And he wrote a key book called The Marriage of East and West, where he saw a lot of overlaps between Hinduism and Christianity. And I certainly learnt a lot, on my own understanding of Christianity either shifted or expanded a lot through that learning from Bede Griffiths. Are you aware of Bede Griffiths' his work at all? That's my ask. I'm asking at that point.
I do remember reading about Bede Griffith, and I would have liked to have seen him when it came to Australia, but on that point I was in Malaysia, so it made it a bit difficult. But the point that he was making was that some of the theologians want him to specify that Christianity was a superior religion, and he said, that I will not do. He said because the pathway and the particular philosophy in Hinduism that he was talking about, Saiva Siddhanta, is the path that I follow. And I could understand where he was coming from. Now, the book of Hindu ethics that of particularly interest to him were the Kural, which is a book of behavioural patterns and proverbs. And the initial translator of that into English, and of course I don't read Tamil, the language is beyond me, but the initial translator of that said these works are so profound, they must have been written by a Christian, and therefore we can say that Hinduism is based on Christianity. And of course that idea is gone well and truly, but this was a person in the very early Victorian era who refused to believe that Hinduism could produce a literature that was so profoundly similar to Christian beliefs. So Bede Griffith has not been the first to do that, but he was an interesting person, and he's certainly somebody I would have liked to have met. As I said, I was in Malaysia at that point, so the opportunity never arose. But I do recollect he came to Adelaide, is that correct?
Certainly came to Perth.
Yeah, so, but it's interesting, other commentators have pointed out that this particular ethical work bears a lot of similarities to the central teaching of Christianity.
Wise idea. I know I've got to speak into the microphone. Thanks for your presentation, Carl. I just want to pick up on the title a bit more, and also some of your comments at the beginning where you were describing your journey. Obviously you started off in a Christian belief system, and then your journey took you into Hinduism and so on, which it comes across to me as you're saying that you progressed to a spirituality you never thought you would have ever had. And I'm just wondering whether you could be a bit more specific or elaborate on the differences. You've talked a little bit about similarities between Hinduism and Christianity, but what is it about Hinduism spirituality that you experienced that from a Christian perspective, it's a development on? Does that make sense?
Yes.
But you better use the mic.
That's an incredibly difficult question. My father was a very devout Christian. He moved from Lutheranism into Anglicanism, and he was well on his way to Catholicism at the time of his death. He was quite profound, and he dealt with that through he was a musician, and he dealt with that through the divinity of music, and particularly the great sacred works of the 16th and 17th century. To him, Bach could have been a disciple. And before I participated in my first festival of Thaipusam in Malaysia, I wrote to my father and I said to him, this is what I'm going to do, and it has a profound spiritual meaning for me, and it is something that I am doing voluntarily. I'm not being duped into it. I'm not being led into a cult or anything like that. And he wrote back and he said, you have my blessing, so long as you're trying to find God. That is what really matters. Some years after he died, I was studying for my PhD in London. I was researching historical records in the India and Oriental Office Library. And in a reflection to my father and in his memory, I went to the early morning service in Sunday at Westminster Abbey because that music reflected his view of Christianity. To him, heaven was a place where Palestrina and Bach and were playing the whole time. And when they got to Paris, I was glad. That great anthem of Paris, I was hopeless. Talk about Alice in Wonderland and in the pool of tears. And on the way out, I said to the attendant, I'm sorry about that. You know, he said, typically British, he said, sir, we noticed nothing. But, and I thought afterwards, my father had tried to find the divine and to plumb the divine through this music. And in a way, his plumbing of the divine through that particular channel reflected something that I could recognise in Hinduism. My discipline has been pilgrimage, Tirthayatra, the movement from the outer world for a brief period to experience massive concentration on the divine. So this is perhaps where and when Wendy and I were having lunch with a Pakistani friend in Kuala Lumpur, he described the Hajj and what he had experienced in Mecca. And I thought, this is incredibly similar to the spirituality I feel at Thaipusam, and which I try to bring back into my own life, not as successfully as I'd like, but it represents an ideal that I would try to bring back. So I think that the great spiritual experiences of any tradition bear a lot of commonality. And I'm not sure that that answers what you were trying to look for, but I see human spirituality as shining through in any religion if people are concentrated, people of goodwill, and I emphasise that, and people that understand what raw spirituality can be. It is of various traditions. I still listen to Gregorian chant and other forms of music, and that doesn't detract at all from who I am. It adds to it.
Got two more. And then
When Christ was preaching in his later years, his philosophy was radically different to what the philosophy he was brought up with. And it's been postulated that Christ travelled to India and Nepal, and I'm wondering if you think, he travelled there in his middle years when we don't know much about him, or he travelled there after he was taken down from the cross, and perhaps he hadn't died. There are people in India who think, and in Nepal, that he died over there, and he's buried in Srinagar in Nepal. And I wondered if you'd done any work on this or thought about it.
That I've been directed to a lot of literature by Hindu friends on that particular issue, that Christ was in India. I'm really not qualified to comment on that, except that much of it doesn't seem to really cohere to me. And there's also been attempts to link Christ to the Mithraic religion, which, of course, was very dominant in Persia and was brought back to Rome through soldiers who served at the frontier. But that idea has there's quite a lot of material written on that. I haven't delved to it in great detail, so I really can't comment on that, except to say that most of what has been, a lot of it has been dominated by Hindu apologetics rather than detailed scholarship. So Hindus incline to the view that all religions will ultimately lead to the same destination. So the idea that Jesus was in India would concur with that particular viewpoint. I notice that they don't try to say that Allah was in India. That would be, I think, a bridge too far. But certainly the idea that Jesus's teachings have a lot in common with Hinduism, the final stages of Hinduism, that viewpoint is quite common. And there were several books that were drawn to my attention on that particular topic, but I really have to say I suppose there's a little bit of residual Lutheranism in me that I didn't find it convincing. I'll say that.
Thanks, Carl. What a fascinating journey you've been having. I read the book Autobiography of a Yogi. Autobiography of a Yogi.
Yeah.
And I was just stunned that the Eastern spirituality had been so, I don't know, not embraced at all. Like, it was so new to me, and some of it blew my mind. And I'm just interested to have your comments on the book. He brought yoga to America. Do you know that book? Autobiography of a Yogi?
Yes, I've come across it.
Yeah, you got any comments about it?
Yes, I think we're talking about the same book. He was rather rejecting of Hindu beliefs. Is that the one?
No, he was quite spiritual.
Oh, okay. So no, I'm thinking of something quite different. The Hindus will always look for synthesis in religious beliefs, and nearly always the Hindu people will not. And in fact, when I was Deputy President of the Hindu Society of South Australia, I had one of these people say that he shouldn't be allowed in the temple because you had to be born into Hinduism to be a Hindu, which is the very antithesis of what Hindus actually believe. One of the things that happened to us in Malaysia, our son was born in Malaysia, and at that point we were required under the law, the rules of diplomats, that we had to have servants, and we're not servant people. So we had three house staff, if you like, whose families remained friends. But when our son was born, Jayalakshmi, the Amma, she came to us and she said, "I'm worried about your son. He's had no blessing. Could we take him to the temple and have him blessed?" You know, and the name, Carl, was, that meant, what did that mean in Wendy? Leg. Yes, that's right. So, yeah. So she wanted to take him to the temple to be blessed. She felt that he had to have some. If he wasn't going to be christened, he had to be blessed. So she took our son to the temple, and Wendy went along as well, and he was blessed in the Hindu temple. And at the time, this was before I had really, you know, my ego was fairly powerful, and it probably still is. But it was only after I got back from Malaysia that all of that I had seen had worked in me. But I visited Jayalakshmi last year when I visited Malaysia, and she's now 82. And she recollected how, she said, "Carl, did your voyage to Hinduism start with your son's blessing?" And I said, "It may have had something to do with it, but at that point I was still determined that I was not going to follow any particular spiritual path." As I said, Hindus of goodwill, particularly in South India and the Dravidian areas, will always try to find some sort of linkage between different religions. And it's notable in South India, they do not have the Hindu-Muslim divide that is prominent in North India. There is a Christian Tamil, the Tamil Methodist Church of Malacca, which always intrigued me. The idea of a quintessentially English version of Christianity. But believe me, if you get into it, it's got a different slant altogether from the Methodism that I knew in Renmark and other places that I grew up in. It's quite interesting. And also they relate very well. A lot of, in the group that I was with in the festival in Malaysia, there were 2 Methodists that participated in this Hindu essential. So they were dedicating it to Murugan, but they said, but Murugan is really just another form of Jesus. So you get this flow in religions like this. Whereas if I'd said the opposite in the Lutheran Church, that would have been a terrible thing. I would have been in terrible trouble. I don't know whether I've answered your question or not.
Mike, did you want to have a final question? Perhaps you can catch Carl at supper and bend his ear a little. Thank you for the questions. It's been really, really interesting. Don's just been waving the little piece of paper at me. You should have been given, as you came in, a little piece of paper with traffic lights across the top that lets us know if you fill it in or just tick one of the traffic lights. It lets us know how well we're doing it with these presentations. So I'll ask you if you could, I think there's some spares if you'd like to, but please do. If you can write a little note as well, something that caught your attention, something that you thought particularly good. It helps us in designing the next lot of presentations, thinking about 2027 already. Before we go to supper, I'd like to recommend to you the next presentation by PC Forum. This one's going to be one out of the box. There will be 2 different ones. I commented earlier that it's really hard to come out on a cold, wet night. So we have 2 people who are willing in July and August to present via Zoom. The way it will work will be there will be the opportunity to come here and to participate as a group with a Zoom presentation, or of course you will be able to ask for the link and as our streaming people do, Zoom in from home as well. So there'll be 2 opportunities. Dr. Lorraine Parkinson is an excellent speaker, and the topic that she's speaking on is the topic of her latest book. She has 2, I think, books. This is the latest one. So she will be actually talking about a book that you will be able to read later. So it should be really interesting. Thank you all for coming. And please join us for some tea, coffee, and I hope some nice supper afterwards. And an opportunity, as I said to Mike, to buttonhole Carl and ask some more interesting questions. And just to finish, it interested me that what Carl has presented tonight is an indication of the fact that we have more in common than we have that sets us apart. So it seems so many things that are shared beliefs, shared pathways, shared interests, shared teachings between all of the major religions, so that we should be behaving as brothers and sisters and listening to one another rather than trying to separate ourselves off and to stay in our little silos. Just a short while ago, I was talking to a friend who's a Christian, and we were talking about the fact that there are so many different paths. We talked about paths to God, and I said to him, "Yep, it's like going up a mountain. There's a lot of different pathways." And he shook his head to me and said, "No." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "There's only one pathway, but there's an awful lot of different people all going up the same pathway." So thank you, Carl, for helping us in our journey up that one pathway. Thank you.